I'm Nick the History Kid. I'm a young patriot who loves history. And today we're in Fort Lee at a Revolutionary War fort. First we will show you the museum, then we will show you the reconstructed fort and tell you why it was so important to protect the Hudson. Fort Lee found its place in American history during the 1776 British campaign to control New York City and the Hudson River. Here is a statue of Major General Nathaniel Greene. He was the commander at Fort Lee. Having resisted the British siege of Boston, George Washington turned his attention to the defense of New York City and Hudson River Valley. Besides construction fortifications at New York and Long Island, Washington felt it imperative for the Army to build and strengthen its defense along the Hudson River. The British plan, meanwhile, was to control the length of the Hudson with the overwhelming dominance of its royal navy. This plan, if successful, would split the colonies in half, bringing in an early end to the American Rebellion. In July 1776, the Americans began fortifying this site, which they first named Fort Constitution. They later changed the name to Fort Lee to honor General Charles Lee, whose army had achieved a major victory at Charleston, South Carolina that summer. On the high ground of northern Manhattan, opposite Fort Lee, work had already begun on another fort, named Fort Washington. On July 12, Admiral Richard Howe sent two British ships, the Rose and the Phoenix, up the Hudson. Cannon fire from Fort Washington had little effect on their passage. Washington ordered work on Fort Lee to proceed as quickly as possible. Huts for the Fort Lee garrison. Shelter for the soldiers was an important adjunct of a military site. In the summer of 1776, the Fort Lee garrison lived in tents, but in October, in anticipation of the coming cold weather, Major General Nathaniel Greene ordered the commanding officers of regiments stationed here to select proper places for barracks for their troops, none nearer to the fort than 50 rods. At General Israel Putnam's suggestions, obstructions were sunk in the river channel between the forts. With these in place and artillery fire from the twin forts, the Americans believed that no British ships would be able to sail past without sustaining severe losses. Here is the George Washington Bridge, and right across where you see that red lighthouse is Fort Washington. They laid the obstructions of the Hudson River. Ships coming up the river and getting shot at both sides of the river and getting stopped at by the blockades Fort Washington set out. By the close of summer of 1776, King George III had sent to New York's harbor the largest force of British ships and troops ever to leave England's shores. By mid-August, Sir William Howe, British Commander-in-Chief and brother to Admiral Howe, had assembled an army over 31,000 British and Hessian troops on Staten Island. Here is a recreation of the fort. And that is the ammunition bunker. Can you imagine cannons on these foundations aiming over the Hudson? August 22nd, the British landed on Long Island. 5 days later, forced the Americans to retreat to New York City. At the time, the city comprised only the southern tip of Manhattan Island. In September, the British took New York City and the rest of Manhattan, except for Fort Washington. On November 16, Fort Washington fell to an overwhelming assault by Crown forces, who captured more than 3,000 American troops. Fort Washington is over there by under the George Washington Bridge. Here I am sitting in the exact location George Washington was before he had to retreat from the British. Washington realized that with the loss of Fort Washington, Fort Lee was of little military value. He ordered General Nathanael Greene, the commander of Fort Lee, to begin preparations to evacuate the fort. An orderly withdrawal, however, was not in store for the Americans. On November 20, just 4 days after taking Fort Washington, General Howe ordered General Charles Cornwallis to convey 5,000 men across the Hudson, several miles north of Fort Lee. When word of the advancing army reached Washington, he ordered an immediate retreat before the Fort Lee troops could be cut off and captured by the British force. Most of the American supplies and artillery had to be left behind. These were indeed among the darkest days for the cause of American liberty, leading Thomas Paine to pen his famous words, "These are the times that try men's souls." I hope you enjoyed our visit in Fort Lee. In the meantime, remember these words my dad and I wrote. New Jersey, from the Revolutionary War to the Jersey Shore, both history and fun awaits you.